Thus, Captain Francis Lord Rawdon observed in August 1775, "As to fighting in the open ground, I believe no advantage of numbers will ever tempt them to do that. But while they have a wall to lie behind, be assured they will fight." And fight they did. The Americans at Bunker Hill on June 17th, 1775, north of Boston, they defended their position at Breed's Hill against the British attacks. The British made 3 pushes against them, and they repelled 2 of those 3, inflicting high casualties. If you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out our other video on this campaign, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But if you're ready, let's go ahead and step in and talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill. Hello everybody, my name is Andrew Raha and I'm an interpreter at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill occurred north of Boston, Massachusetts on the Charlestown Peninsula on June 17th, 1775. Now, the American army at that point wasn't really a thing. The battles of Lexington and Concord had just concluded about a month and a half prior, and the Americans at that point were largely collected groups of militias from colonies like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. So the New England colonies at this point were in revolt. However, the other colonies had yet to be fully convinced after the battle to join the war, and so the initial efforts were made, the Continental Congress, to assemble enough of a support for the war to actually go into the conflict as a unified front. Now, while this is going on, the city of Boston's being besieged by these militias. And so the Americans around Boston were yet to be formed into a formalized army. That won't happen quite yet. The beginnings start to develop in May, but the army isn't fully acknowledged and created until a bit later. At that time, several high-ranking officials from within the Massachusetts and other state governments in the area start to come into the militia camps and start to do what they can to organize things. One of those officers is Ward, General Ward. General Ward will become the overall commander until he's eventually replaced by Washington later on. But he will become the commander of the American forces in Boston at the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And when the battle starts to get underway, or when they start to come up to the period where the battle actually takes place, what kind of triggers it, what kind of puts everyone into the sudden urge to fight after about a month and a half of standing around. The Americans are at that point not besieging the town in the proper sense. They're not laying siege with artillery yet. They are mostly just having surrounded the town and preventing British forces from leaving at this point. So the Americans were getting bored. This was a bit of an issue for a lot of the American commanders at the time. It is difficult to control hundreds, or even in this case thousands of men who have shown up voluntarily out of their own free will as militias, spoiling for a fight and not getting one. A lot of these guys decided it wasn't worth sticking around and they started to go home. This presented a huge problem because Congress was still negotiating, we're still working with each other, all the states were still negotiating with each other to try to form this unified front, to try to form an army, to try to determine whether they were going to go to all-out war with the British. And so what ends up happening is that the Americans do decide to form a unified front. They do decide to go engage with the British. However, the local militias weren't going to necessarily get a lot of additional support in the short term. And the British had started to mass troops, particularly by the late May, by the last week of May or so. British reinforcements had arrived, including several newer commanders. So in addition to General Gage, who had been in command of Boston for a while by this point, he is also bringing in officers like General Howe, General Clinton, General Burgoyne. And if you know anything about the American Revolution, particularly on the British side, those names will be very familiar to you. They are going to come over with reinforcements in May of 1775, or late May in 1775. And with those additional reinforcements, Gage is starting to get pressure to take the heights around Boston to secure his position and ensure the Americans are unable to engage in an actual proper siege. The Americans recognize that these reinforcements arriving means that this is what's about to happen next. So the Americans recognize that they now need to actually take these heights around Boston. One of those heights, one of those positions, is Charlestown. The Charlestown Peninsula at the time was one of the few access points that the British could easily get to get out of the city. Boston at that point in history was much more isolated on not a full island, but more of a peninsula at that point. So Boston itself as a city, a lot of the areas that you might know of today if you live in Boston or around that area, a lot of that was underwater at the time of the American Revolution. And so the city was much more isolated and was much easier to cut off, especially if you could get a hold of those heights and you could bring artillery into those positions to actually engage the city and engage the defenses there and engage the British shipping. So the British needed to take those heights. Now on Charlestown Island, there are several high hills that are going to rise up somewhere between 60 and 100 feet above sea level, lowest ones being around 35 feet. And so these positions, might not seem terribly high, but they're high enough that a good artillery position on those hills would get control of a lot of the northern part of Boston. And so the Americans recognized the need to take them. So the way they handle this, the way they decide they're going to engage this, is that they're going to send a couple of colonels, a couple of officers, along with their regiments and a few other regiments, up to the heights to try to hold on to them, provide defensive works, and make sure the British aren't able to take those positions. And so the people decided that they're decided to go up to those positions are going to be the regiments of Colonel Prescott and Colonel Putnam. Now, Colonel Prescott and Colonel Putnam, again, they're militia commanders of the Massachusetts militia, and they are going to lead their regiments, along with regiments from other states, including Connecticut and New Hampshire, eventually, up to those positions. So they meet in the evening on June 16th in Cambridge. They assemble the troops and the equipment they needed, along with Putnam's forces for digging in. They have a lot of entrenching equipment along with them. And they move out in the evening. And then overnight, they get onto the Charlestown Peninsula, which is not too far away. And they get to the position that they were expected to fortify, that they were intended to fortify. Largely, this decision had been made by the Massachusetts Committee of Public Safety. So the Americans, as they're forming their new governments, created a number of committees of public safety. And these are largely designed to run the war effort. They're usually made up of high-ranking political representatives from within the colony. And so for Massachusetts Committee of Public Safety has sent these troops to Charlestown Peninsula to actually secure what was Bunker Hill. And Bunker Hill was the tallest hill on the island in one of the more forward positions. Now, Bunker Hill wasn't the only hill, and the more important hill for our story is Breed's Hill, which is ahead of Bunker Hill. And the Americans, when they arrive on the Charlestown Peninsula, recognize that the position they most wish to take, and there's not a whole lot of detailed reasoning given by the officers at the time, but the hill they choose to take instead of Bunker Hill was Breed's Hill. They did put some light fortification on Bunker Hill. It was basically intended to be a position they could fall back to, but Breed's Hill was the position they decided to fortify, and overnight they built it into a fortification. It is mostly square in size, about 100 yards or so in square. The Americans are going to leave the back end somewhat open so they can leave from that position. And on top of the hill, they had a fairly commanding position over the top of the end of the Charlestown Peninsula. So any attempt to land on the peninsula would need to pass Breed's Hill and be engaged by the troops at Breed's Hill in order to pass. However, there was one significant weakness that was recognized as soon as daylight started to come up, and that was that the American left flank up to the Mystic River there was enough space there that an enemy force could theoretically move through that space without receiving significant fire. And that would have allowed them to outflank the position and overtake them. So the Americans extend the left breastwork by about another 100 yards or so. And then in addition to that, later they also recognized that the British might even be able to send a small detachment up the side of the Mystic River, which is on the north side, the east side rather, of the peninsula, and the Americans would be outflanked. So the Americans, in order to prevent this circumstance, are going to send additional reinforcements to that position to fortify it, particularly 2 New Hampshire regiments under the command of Colonel Stark and Colonel Reed. And those 2 men, their New Hampshire regiments, supported by other detachments from the Connecticut and Massachusetts men that were on Breed's Hill, are going to hold the left flank of the battlefield. And that left flank, that downhill portion, somewhat to the back of the Americans a bit on Breed's Hill, is going to be the site of a lot of the major portion of the engagement here, at Bunker Hill. The British, for their own circumstances, are totally caught by surprise. They have no idea the Americans do this, and when they wake up on the morning of June 17th, one of the British ships in the bay starts to see that the Americans have built this fortification and begins to open fire. And this is the first significant indication that now the Americans have taken the Charlestown Peninsula. They also have skirmishers that are located in the city of Charleston. At that point is on the lower side of the island, on the American right flank. And so now the British recognize they have to start moving. They have to get going. They have to engage. So the British operation starts, they start assembling their men once they get together in the morning. So they recognize in the morning that something needs to be done. There's a assembly of the officers, those officers I mentioned before, Gage, Burgoyne, Clinton, and Howe, and they get together and they make a plan for how they're going to tackle this position and overcome the Americans, seize the Charlestown Peninsula. And the ultimate plan that comes about, and the one that is decided on, is that they're going to land on the east side of the peninsula and start to advance westward. And they're going to try to outmaneuver the Americans by maneuvering along the Mystic River around the American flank, as the Americans did recognize was probably their weakest point. The British are assembled by about noon, and they start to make their way across the river. By about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they've gotten across the bay, across the river, onto the peninsula. Once they're onto the peninsula, the British are delayed temporarily as Howe starts to recognize the Americans had fortified the position he had intended to press into. So now that the Americans are fortified in the area in which he had intended to push, they had some fortification. It was a light fortification. However, the British didn't know that and were unwilling to take risk in this regard. Howe orders for reinforcements and does not begin the operation to actually take the Americans until 3:30. Now, this delay would have been something that the Americans would have taken advantage of to continue building up their small fortifications that they had on that far left flank. So the British decide that that's where they're going to engage. And the way they organize their troops for battle is they're going to take the light infantry companies, and for the most part, the British force is going to consist of about 1,500 men. The Americans at this point are also around 1,000, quite a bit more than 1,000, maybe another 1,500 men as well. And the British are going to reinforce their right flank and engage the Americans in that position, with the light infantry being formed in column. So the men are front to back. They're 1 man in a row, about 4 men across in a row, marching forward. And they're going to send that column along the Mystic River. Now, the Mystic River, just like the bluffs here at Yorktown, adjacent to the river, there's a drop-off and there's a sandy beach. And so if you're up on the top of the bluff, you can't see down into that position, and it could be easily used to circumvent the enemy forces and come up behind them or attack them from the flank. So the British intend to use this. The Americans have already recognized it, though, and have built fortifications on the beach as well to stop the British advance. The remainder of the British forces, the Grenadiers, are going to be sent in line against the main American fortifications at the rails in an attempt to engage, destroy, overcome, and then turn the flank and engage the rest of Breed's Hill. General Howe is actually commanding this force and is going to lead it from the front, and the operation kicks off. The British start to advance. The column that's advancing along the riverbank comes up to the American forces, and the Americans wait, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait some more. And eventually, the British get close, something close to about 50 yards or so. The Americans had an issue for this whole operation, was that they were lacking in supplies, particularly ammunition, particularly gunpowder and lead. And so the American soldiers, and American officers in particular, recognized that they needed to make the most efficient use of the equipment that they had. So as the British close to a close distance, and they're in these dense column formations, which was ideal at that time as a method of shock tactics to overcome fortified positions. However, the position they were engaged against was substantially dug in. The Americans open up in a massive volley from close range. In addition to that, General Howe's forces that are marching across the open field encounter several obstacles they didn't anticipate. The open field had fairly tall grass, and so there were a lot of hidden walls, low walls, and fences that the British had to go over. Now, this wouldn't necessarily have been the biggest issue, except for the fact that these British troops were not battle-tested at this point, and they tended to have a proclivity to break down into fire when they felt that they were incredibly pressured. So as the Americans opened up on the British forces, the British responded with firepower. This was a mistake. The American position was not heavily dug in. If the British had pressed on and advanced, according to several British officers present at the battle, they suggested and they believed pretty wholeheartedly that if the British had just pushed on and engaged the American forces in hand-to-hand combat with the bayonet, they likely would have carried the Americans off the battlefield and driven them from the field. The problem is, when they try to get over these walls, they are so interrupted in their formations that fire discipline breaks down, organization breaks down, the soldiers are no longer in proper orderly form, they're not advancing any longer, and this stalls out the attack and leads to massive casualties on the British side. The British are forced to withdraw. The column formations had also been devastated, and they too were forced to withdraw. And an interesting thing about that column formation was that the bulk of the troops in the column that were engaging along the beach were part of the 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. Their redoubt here at Yorktown is right over there. So the British, in that battle, those Welsh Fusiliers are going to learn that engaging the Americans, you really have to push in aggressively and you have to get them, but they also learn the value of defensive works. Not that they didn't already know any of that beforehand, but it certainly was a lesson that would stick. When it comes to the British on the open field, of course, they are also suffering extensive casualties and are forced to pull back. Now, General Howe, he is not extremely deterred. He feels that the Americans can be pushed off the field, that this blunder, this error for the soldiers having broken down their fire discipline can be solved. Now, at the same time, a second commander of the British forces are sent to engage main force at Breed's Hill and make sure they're occupied, and they too are repelled by the Americans. Again, also engaging in linear formations, and this isn't to say linear formations were not effective, but they're going up against fortified positions. They need to take the positions since the enemy is dug in behind them. They're standing in the open field. It's not going to be the most effective way to take a fortified position. And this was known. The recommendation for how to take a fortified position this time is columns, aggressive attacks straight up into the enemy formations. But that wasn't what the British did. Now, General Howe, once he withdraws his men, decides that it is, once he gets them reorganized, that the plan wasn't entirely a failure, it's just a failure execution, and so they needed to just try it again. And so he again pushes his men into the open field. He sends them up against the American fortification to the rail fence, and he pushes them forward. And again, they are pretty brutally savaged by the American fire, which is kept up in a pretty relentless pace. The trouble for the Americans at this point is that they are starting to run significantly low on ammunition. So the Americans repel the second British assault, and the British at this point realize that attacking on the American left, on the British right flank, is not going to be a success. The Americans have two major advantages: the fortification that they're behind, and the fact that the British are attacking across an open field, and Breed's Hill, the American fortified position, is to their left, shooting down at them. So they are being attacked not only from the front, but from their left flank. And as a result, they're suffering pretty significant casualties because they are in an open field, engaging two fortified positions while trying to overtake one of them. So instead, the British decide to reposition for the third assault. The third assault, the British are going to go ahead and fortify, or going to move to their left flank. The Americans now at the rail fence, the New Hampshire troops, are out of position. They're unable to support the Americans against this attack, and the American skirmishers that had been in Charlestown had been driven out because British ships had gone ahead, used hot shot, which is heated cannonballs, fired them into the town of Charlestown and started to burn the whole city. So as the town starts to burn, the American skirmishers are forced out. And so now there is not much defending the American right flank aside from the fortification at Breed's Hill. So the British go ahead and they mass their troops again, and this time they make another assault from the left side, or the right side of the American fortification, the left side of the British ranks, up against the hill. This time, the Americans are out of ammunition, supplies, and they are unable to properly repel the assault. The British are able to get up, the Grenadiers get into the works, the Americans start to be cut down with the bayonet, and those that have been cut down flee. The Americans do manage to escape in a somewhat decent order, however, their forces are pretty badly mauled. This, however, is nothing compared to what the British are suffering from. The British have suffered significantly more casualties at this point, and of course the British soldiers that get into the fortification have a bit of revenge to take out. About 30 Americans get cut off and bayoneted to death within the fortification. The Americans that do escape, they manage to retreat, withdraw, along with the New Hampshire troops that were at the rail fence, now having been out of position, pull back to Bunker Hill. Once at Bunker Hill, the Americans continue the withdrawal off the Charlestown Peninsula, and the British are managed to carry the day and take the fortification, as well as the whole peninsula as well. But the casualties they suffered were appalling to the British at the time. And of course, the Americans found it to be not necessarily a victory, but a great show of strength, and that they could too hold their own against the British regulars and actually engage in a successful battle. So this battle is going to hold a lot of significance throughout the rest of the war. And there are plenty of other channels and videos and other depictions of Bunker Hill that have talked about how the Americans saw the battle, what kind of cultural, political influence the battle had. But one thing that may be a little more overshadowed is the impact it had on the mindset of the British Army going forward through the rest of the war and how they would continue to engage the Americans. One of the lessons brought out of the conflict, out of the battle, by the British and by Generals Howe, Burgoyne, Clinton, commanders who again will command large armies throughout the rest of the war, is that the Americans, they value the breastworks, they valued the defensive works a great deal, and their men might not be the most stable in an open field. They might not be willing to stand and fight when the enemy gets close or when the enemy has a good shot on them. And so the Americans preferred to use those defensive works. The trouble with the defensive work is it's static. You can't move it anywhere. And so the British, from the rest of the war, will do their absolute level best at any opportunity to circumvent, move around, or evade enemy field fortifications. They will do what they can to use shock tactics and aggressive pushes against lightly trained, lightly motivated American troops that might not be able to stand and fight. And this works very well for them going forward. But it was a lesson that was learned in a very bloody engagement at Bunker Hill. Now, when it comes to overall casualties during the course of the battle, the Americans and the British will both suffer pretty significantly, but the British much more so than the Americans. When it comes to overall forces engaged, there were about 2,400 American soldiers by the end of the fight that had been engaged during the battle, and about 3,000 British troops had ultimately seen combat. About 1,500 had landed initially, and then reinforcement brought out for every subsequent attack. So we're going to go ahead and use a little bit of cheat sheet here I have, because this allows me to get a little bit more detail on some of the specifics of what we're talking about. The British initially had about 1,500 troops. Reinforcements throughout the course of the battle brought the total participants of the British Army to around 3,000 men. There were about 1,000 American militias initially sent out with Putnam and Prescott in the initial opening stages of the fortification. Additional reinforcements will be sent to them, including 2 regiments of New Hampshire troops and some other regiments of other Massachusetts and Connecticut militia. Ultimately, there were about 2,400 American soldiers involved during the battle. There were about 226 British soldiers killed and about 828 wounded on the British side. And those numbers are the best we have as far as the records go. There's some variation depending on the source you're looking at, but that's primarily the number we're going to go with. And there were about 140 Americans killed and about 271 wounded. So there are about half the number of Americans killed during the battle and about a quarter of the same number, about a third of the same number wounded. So the Americans suffered significantly lower casualties than the British during the course of the battle. The total dead for the whole battle was about 366 dead and about 1,099 men wounded. So the British and the Americans, after the battle, go back to their respective camps. The Americans continue to occupy the territory around Boston. The British had never actually managed to break out. The British, on the other hand, returned to Boston and continue to be relatively static and non-committal. Of course, the battle being such a bloody engagement meant that people like General Howe were forced to go back to England to explain it, and other commanders Gage was sent back to England to have to explain the casualties suffered in the battle, and General Howe was reluctant to engage again against the Americans out of fear of engaging and suffering the same types of casualties that he suffered at Bunker Hill. Ultimately, the Americans will have people like General Washington arriving, forming the Provincial American Army, the first U.S. Army that's organized by Congress. American regiments will start to be formed in proper fashion. They'll start to see the first uniforms starting to come about because, of course, these soldiers fighting at Bunker Hill would have been ununiformed. They would have been wearing whatever they brought with them when they left home. And then in addition to all of that, the Battle of Bunker Hill ultimately meant that because the British were unwilling to come out of the town, the Americans had time to bring up artillery, get their forces organized, and besiege the city in a proper manner and force the British off the continent. And the British won't return until 1776 in New York. And I'm sure that's where we'll probably pick this story up again at some point. It's a pretty interesting battle, the Battle of Long Island's a very interesting fight, so hopefully we'll cover that at some point in the future as well. And if you were paying attention throughout the video, another thing you might have noticed is the reference to the Welsh Fusiliers. If you've seen our previous video in this series, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, we also mentioned that the Welsh Fusiliers were a participant in that battle as well. They have a bit of a connection to us here at Yorktown because the Welsh Fusilier readout is right over here, and at the Battle of Yorktown, they were significant participants. In fact, they repelled within their fortification an assault by the French army, who also formed in line formations and engaged them trying to use firepower tactics. The Americans and the French will not repeat that mistake when they attempt to attack redoubts 9 and 10, having instead used column formations, having unloaded their firearms in the American case to ensure that the soldiers got into the fortifications as quickly and efficiently as possible to prevent the enemy from cutting them down at a distance, attacking at night, and using all the advantages that they can come up with to try to seize those really heavily fortified positions. Something that, of course, the British might have been able to be a little bit more effective with had they attempted that at Bunker Hill. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. We hope you enjoyed that. The quote I read out of in the beginning is going to comes right out of With Zeal and with Bayonets Only, book by Matthew Spring, British Army on Campaign in North America. And this is a fantastic source if you'd like to learn about how warfare was done in the 18th century, and particularly how the British Army fought during both the French and Indian War, the Revolution, some of the other conflicts that engaged in the late 18th century. We also use The Glorious Cause, a fantastic book that gives a good overview of the whole revolution, and it has a nice section on Bunker Hill in particular, which helped fill in any gaps that were made by this book here. There are a few other sources we use, which we can put in the description here to let you know if you're looking for additional reading on the topic. Well, of course, after the battle, good old Washington here ends up taking command, and the rest, as they say, is history.